Welcome, everyone. This is a much anticipated and important meeting. And thank you, Dr. Alex Duwal. Thank you, Alex Smith, for being here with us on behalf of Doctors Against Genocide. This is an event that is sponsored by Doctors Against Genocide. It's also sponsored by Nurses Against Genocide, by Jewish Voices for Peace, Boston, Massachusetts Peace Action, Animal Healthcare Workers Against Genocide, Healthcare Workers for Palestine, and Jewish Voices for Peace Health Advisory Council. Thank you, everyone, for promoting this event. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alex Duwal. Dr. Alex Duwal is a researcher on African elite politics. He's also the executive director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He was a fellow of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative at Harvard University, as well as the program director at the Social Science Research Council on AIDS in New York City. Dr. Duwal recently has been commenting on what is happening in Gaza. In January 2024, Dr. Duwal stated that Israel was committing a war crime through enforced starvation in the Gaza Strip, stating an entire population being reduced to this stage is really unprecedented. We have not seen it in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Yemen, pretty much anywhere else in the world. He said it is the worst man-made famine in 75 years. We look forward to hearing from him about any updates with what is happening in Gaza right now. Alex Smith is a senior advisor on gender, maternal health, child health, and nutrition. Welcome, Alex. We are honored, and it's our pleasure to have you. Alex made the difficult decision of between resigning or being fired after a presentation he was due to deliver on child mortality among Palestinians. This presentation was canceled by USAID leadership. In his resignation letter to the head of USAID, Samantha Power, he alleged that the agency was treating the war in Gaza and Palestinians differently than other conflicts and humanitarian emergencies. In his letter of the resignation, Alex said, "I cannot do my job in an environment in which specific people cannot be acknowledged as fully human, or where gender and human rights principles apply to some, but not to others, depending on their race." Both Alex and Alex embody what it means for us to be Doctors Against Genocide. You have spoken up against genocide, you have leveraged your influence, and you have inspired others to do the same. We are honored to have you both with us today. And please start. I think, what is the order? Who would like to start first?
I think we are in your hands, whichever
Okay.
you would.
So maybe Alex Smith starts, and Dr. Alex Duwal goes after. And then we will do questions and answer, Dr. Jbour and myself, and we'll take it. Please start, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karame. That was a great introduction. You got everything exactly right, except that you said it was a difficult decision to leave USAID. It wasn't difficult at all. It was very clear that that was the correct thing to do. I really decided I did not want to be part of an organization that couldn't talk about global health and human rights in Gaza. So yes, as you said, I've worked in this field for about 23 years now. I've worked in Afghanistan and Sudan and South Sudan with refugee communities in Jordan. For more than a decade, I earned a JD MPH I studied also at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and had the great honor in 2012 of being a fellow at the International Criminal Court, the Office of the Prosecutor. So though I'm a global health person, I also have a background in international criminal law and international humanitarian law. When I was working at the prosecutor's office, I several times wrote legal briefs about starvation in conflict and cited Dr. Alex Duval many times in those briefs, as he is the authority on starvation in conflict. And I would say just briefly, my personal interest in Palestine started about 20 years ago, reading Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmad and others. And in my early 20s, I traveled to Israel and the West Bank to volunteer with a human rights organization. I was based in Nablus, documenting human rights violations and everyday abuses at checkpoints and in Palestinian homes. And not far away, around the same time, a young American named Rachel Corrie was volunteering for the same organization when she was killed by the IDF in Rafah. So that was an experience, though it was 20 years ago. That kind of thing sticks with you over the decades. And as you said, just a few months ago in May, I was scheduled to give a presentation at a conference for USAID colleagues and partners titled An Intersectional Gender Lens in Gaza, Ethnicity, Religion, and Legal Status, and Maternal Child Health Outcomes. It's a long story, but the presentation was heavily censored. Words like Palestine, Palestinian state, Israel, Gaza border were prohibited. And I even offered to do the presentation without slides if it could go ahead. But it was canceled the day before it was meant to go on. I hope the irony isn't lost on USAID leadership that in trying to quash a presentation that would have been seen by maybe 30 people at the most, they've made this into a much larger news story that's been seen on CNN and NPR and Al Jazeera, English and Arabic. And now I'm presenting some of these facts to 200 people I think we have lined up. Mm-hmm. So needless to say, I'd done many presentations previously. I'd just done several on Nepal and Zambia a few months earlier with no editorial control from leadership. So it was quite a shock to see speech on a global health issue being quashed like that. Looking back on it, my reasons for wanting to speak about Gaza in the first place, I had a few months to think about this now since May. There are three reasons really. First, the obvious one, that there didn't seem to be any urgency from USAID leadership to raise alarm bells about getting aid in now. There was also a lack of urgency to plan for rebuilding the health system the day after the conflict. I had volunteered for the Ukraine rapid response to rebuild the health systems, to rebuild health infrastructure the day after the conflict. There weren't plans like that for Gaza, and I was alarmed by that. Second, it's the principle of the thing in the global health and human rights world. There shouldn't be any taboo subjects. We should be allowed to present public health data, no matter whose health we're talking about. And finally, I was thinking about this today. When this conflict ends one day, I don't think it'll be this weekend with the ceasefire talks. When humanitarian organizations rush back in and aid and human rights organizations are allowed to look at the extent of the atrocities that have been committed, I think they'll likely find that in Gaza, tens of thousands more will have died from starvation and disease. We've seen this in previous conflicts in Yemen and Afghanistan and Syria. We know that for every person who's killed with a bomb or a bullet, 2 or 3 times as many may die from preventable communicable disease. So I really don't want to see US officials and Israeli officials saying in the future, we knew about the 40,000 people, even though even that number is often disputed, strangely. We knew about those 40,000 people, and yeah, okay, we knew about the 10,000 people under the rubble. But we didn't know about these, 70 or 80,000 other deaths. Where did they come from? We have no idea. Those tens of thousands just died somehow, and nobody could have seen that coming. So the presentation, the point of it was in large part to make it known that we can predict outcomes very accurately based on the body of global health research and in previous conflicts, studies from previous conflicts. So as sure as night follows day, we know, for example, that starvation in a population will lead directly to weakened immune systems and outbreaks of infectious disease. These are the direct consequences of policy choices that Israel and the United States have made. If you destroy all of the health facilities and displace tens of thousands of pregnant women, you'll see a much higher maternal mortality ratio. If you starve people, you'll see increases in deaths from respiratory infection and other preventable illnesses. If you cut water off and destroy all of the sewage treatment facilities, you'll see a huge spike in deaths from cholera. You'll see cases of meningitis and hepatitis and a higher risk of polio. So we know that children who are starved are especially susceptible to diarrheal and respiratory illness. We know that pregnant women who are starved from protein-rich foods are much more likely to develop anemia and die from bleeding, and that the means to treat bleeding are also bombed out of existence. Again, so all of these policy choices are extremely predictable in their results. We know exactly what will happen when these choices are made. So I hate to be a Cassandra on this, but you can quote me on it. I think in the aftermath, if there ever is an aftermath of all of this, officials in the US and Israel will be asked about these deaths, and they will put their concerned faces on and shrug and say, well, that's war, people die more. I've said that already about the bombing. Or they'll say Gaza was a backward, poor third world place. And of course, you'll have many terrible health outcomes in a place like that. To which I would point out that in 2022, Gaza actually had a very low maternal mortality ratio, lower than the regional average, and in fact, slightly lower than the United States in 2022. So I'll talk about that as well if we have time. So my presentation, it was looking at health statistics leading up to the current state of affairs. I was looking at DHS and UNFPA data, Demographic Health Survey, and the UN Population Funds data from about 2007 to today. Given that in 2022, before this conflict, 1.3 million out of 2.1 million Palestinians in Gaza, about 62%, required food assistance to meet basic needs. And again, that was a policy choice. People in the Israeli government famously said the idea is to put Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. So to be clear, food insecurity in Gaza was never an accident or environmental catastrophe. It was always there by design. Another policy choice was that 78% of piped water in Gaza was unfit for human consumption. Only about 22% was fit. Despite this, what I found in the data, the DHS data, was that Gaza had remarkably low maternal mortality ratio. It was higher in previous years. And there were, for example, one issue I was interested in exploring was deaths from risky roadside births, because I've been to the West Bank and I've seen IDF soldiers prevent people from getting to hospitals for no reason other than they seem to think that was hilarious. So given the impediments of getting to a facility, I wondered if there might be a spike in maternal mortality from that. And there were quite a few reports around the first Intifada, about 2005 to 2007, that women were being denied. There were many risky roadside births, and there were quite a few 60 or so infant deaths that could be attributed directly to that. And yet, that problem seemed to decline over time, not because the checkpoints disappeared, of course, but because women were making plans to either have home births or to make a plan to get to a facility about 2 weeks ahead of time so that they would be prepared. But so it was shocking to see that maternal mortality ratio was so low. It did spike up to about 30 during COVID, but it spiked up everywhere in the world during COVID. We saw a similar spike in the United States, for example, to about 32 deaths per 100,000 live births. But yeah, it was similar to Jordan and Lebanon, significantly lower than Morocco and lower than the SDG target. So again, when in the future, if people claim that maternal mortality was always high in Gaza and that Israel didn't have an impact on that, we need to be cognizant that conflict has these very predictable outcomes. So why, I also looked into why that maternal mortality ratio was so low in Gaza and the West Bank. One attributing factor is that the literacy rate is extremely high, and we know that there are associations between literacy and higher ANC visits, antenatal care visits, skilled birth attendants, and postnatal care services than among illiterate populations. Another theory that was that perhaps diaspora doctors had a big impact on Gaza when physicians who were very well trained decided to go back to Gaza. Another reason that I didn't put in the presentation, but I looked into, was that societies that are subject to traumas like genocide, there's often evidence of a replacement effect. Having experienced the death of a child during a genocide reduces the time to the first birth after the genocide. For example, we know this from the Rwandan genocide. Simply put, that when there's a demographic, when people are trying to ethnically cleanse your population, people tend to have more births and have more healthy births if they can. So that might be one contributing reason as well. And then, of course, the presentation got into the conditions since October 2023. The data, of course, is sparse. There are a few really notable reports from UN, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, from the few agencies that have been able to have some people on the ground, reporting, for example, a 300% increase in miscarriages. We know that at any given moment, there are about 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, and 5,500 are expected to give birth within the next month, according to UNFPA. In May, the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported the treatment of pregnant and lactating women continues to be appalling, with direct bombardment of hospitals and deliberate denial of access to healthcare facilities by Israeli snipers, combined with the lack of beds and medical resources, placing an estimated 50,000 pregnant women and 20,000 newborn babies at unimaginable risk. Throughout the last 10 months, we've seen over 183 women per day giving birth without any pain relief, while hundreds of babies have died because of lack of electricity to power incubators. If you've ever visited a maternity ward or a NICU, the NICU is always very well heated, and the incubators are running 24/7 without that power. You see more deaths that are completely preventable. So obviously the destruction of hospitals has had a huge impact on facility births, on being able to give birth with a skilled birth attendant in a facility in a sterile place to prevent infection. OHCHR has documented systematic attacks on hospitals and other medical facilities, such that currently over 80% of all health facilities in Gaza have been destroyed or non-functioning. In May, when I was giving this presentation, just a few weeks before my presentation, the medical staff at Kuwaiti Hospital in Rafah had just received an evacuation order. They were one of the last remaining hospitals in Rafah, and had only about 16 beds available for more than 1 million people sheltering in Rafah, where the entire population, or most of the population, had been displaced to that area. The targeting of medical staff, according to, again, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Israel has killed over 500 health workers in Gaza since the 7th of October. For example, in January, Israel dropped a 1,000-pound missile package from an F-16 on the house of a medical aide for a Palestinian doctor and their family. We've also seen reports of health workers being arrested, tortured, disappeared, or killed in Israeli custody. For example, Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, the head of orthopedics at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, was arrested along with 10 other medical workers in December during the Israeli military ground invasion of the Jabalia refugee camp. The same doctor, Dr. Albersh, had been threatened by the IDF before to either move south or face arrest. So he was killed. He was killed in custody in May after months in detention. So obviously, destroying the hospitals is one thing. Even when hospitals are partially functional, every hospital has been bombed, but some are at least partially functional. I'm sure everybody remembers that over 390 bodies have been discovered at Nasser and Al-Shifa hospitals in mass graves. And I think it's 7 times now I've counted. Hospitals have been taken over by the IDF, and then when they leave, mass graves are found, reportedly showing signs of torture and of summary executions. So I would say that that's quite a deterrent from seeking facility births. If you're a woman in labor, you're unlikely to want to go to a place that's been many times over targeted for these kinds of killings. So we can assume that word's gotten wrong. So that's the overview. I would just really quickly go through some of the very predictable outcomes. I mentioned that OHCHR had reported that miscarriages were up about 300%. International Planned Parenthood Federation also reported that women in Gaza have been losing their babies from stress and shock of war. And that's, as I said before, consistent with what we've seen in other conflicts, that the risk of miscarriage was significantly higher in women with a history of exposure to psychological stress. And in many of these studies on stress, it's generally defined as financial or marital problems, things like divorce or intimate partner abuse, relocation and exposure to unfamiliar conspecifics. These were listed as some of the reasons for stress that caused a doubling of miscarriages. I think it's safe to say that in Gaza, women have certainly been under stress. Nearly all have been forcibly displaced many times over under threat of imminent death. They've been financially ruined, lost all of their possessions, their homes, which is usually the most valuable possession. Many have lost family members for more than 300 days. Every man, woman, and child has lived with the knowledge that at any moment they can be killed, that it's entirely possible to die at any moment. So that's the stress that could cause a 300% increase in miscarriages. We also see in many other conflicts incidents of low birth weight babies and prematurity. And these are known to have severe effects on child well-being, overall child health, developmental disability, asthma diagnosis, and other negative health outcomes. We know that when women can't go to ANC, antenatal care visits, we recommend 4. We assume that women in Gaza are getting to very few or none. We'll see a rise in the 3 main causes of maternal death, which are severe bleeding, infections, high blood pressure during pregnancy. I mentioned before, iron increases the risk of anemia and bleeding. There also aren't the facilities and resources to treat that. So postpartum hemorrhage, for example, meaning severe bleeding, being the most common cause of death, can kill a healthy woman within hours if it's left unattended. Injecting oxytocin immediately after childbirth can effectively reduce that risk of bleeding. But UNFPA and others have been trying to get those drugs in many cases failing to get those drugs in through the security checks. We also know that birthing kits have been stopped at the border because they contain scissors to cut an umbilical cord. Entire shipments of entire truckloads have been turned around because of birth kits that the IDF considers unacceptable. And briefly wanted to touch on nutrition, and then I'd like to turn over to Alex DeWell, who is the subject area expert on nutrition and starvation and conflict. Again, we know a lot about the effects of famine and food insecurity. We know, for example, that the toll of hunger on the human body, it's going to be young people who die first, children, because they need more energy, their brains are still developing, and they need to have plenty of energy to turn carbohydrates into glucose before the body starts getting its energy from fat, and then getting protein from muscles. And we're obviously going to see a lot of weakened immune systems, especially in children again, and a lot of very preventable deaths from preventable infectious disease, and from diarrheal disease, and from skin rashes. And we're already seeing, massive numbers of hepatitis cases, of measles. Polio has now been detected from 4 different sample sites. So in conclusion, again, my sort of alarm bell that I really want to ring, that I don't think is getting enough attention in media or even in many of our circles of human rights advocates, is that the deaths we're seeing now will continue, even after a ceasefire is called. We're going to see a lot of deaths from very preventable diarrheal disease and the result of, cutting off water and destroying water facilities throughout the Gaza Strip. Those deaths were preventable. They were not inevitable, but they are the results of policy choices that Israel and the United States have made to not allow in-birthing kits, to not allow food and to cut off water, to document in one case the destruction of the Rafah reservoir, denying water to all of the people there. And when this comes up in a tribunal or in the media, people are going to claim that they didn't know about those deaths, or that there's no way of knowing about those deaths. But I'd like to really make the case that we certainly can predict those deaths every time. And I'll turn it back to you,
Alex. Thank you, Alex, for this comprehensive but unfortunately painful presentation and data. Some people are asking if you have any slides of what you mentioned, any numbers or figures. If you can share them, please, because some people would like to. It will be easier for them to keep track of this data. If you can share a few slides, then we can switch to Dr. Waal, please.
I'm just putting a link to the slides in the chat. Go ahead. I was gonna put in my resignation letter too, if anybody's interested in seeing it.
Perfect, thank you. And I think now we can proceed with Dr. Waal. Please welcome, and we're ready for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And first of all, my condolences and commiserations to all of you who have lost family members and other loved ones in this conflict, and those of you who are living day to day with the anxiety and the trauma and the stress of having those you love living under these conditions, and or too often not knowing what is happening to them. Secondly, I'd like to just commend Alex for his candor, and I think one of the things that comes across most strikingly is how simple it is to tell the truth when the facts are known. And I'm sure you will have found this personally, if I may put yourself in your shoes. Telling the facts as they are is, first of all, liberating, because denying, lying, concealing, manipulating is a burden. And you can see that burden often physically on the people who are endeavoring to present something that they know simply is not true. People who are otherwise individuals of good conscience, who, let us say, joined USAID, your colleagues, who joined because they genuinely wanted to do good in the world, but find themselves in a situation where they are justifying evil and the difficulties they face, and how liberating it is to say, nonsense, this is how it is. And also when you know who your friends are when you speak out like this, you know who truly points that we the many points of our careers where we might have intersected. But let me start just with one, which is that I had the privilege just over 2 years ago of being an expert witness, a joint witness actually for both prosecution and defense at the ICC on the Darfur case. And I presented a graph which showed how the spikes in violence in the early months of the Darfur conflict, the battles, but also the atrocities against civilians, were followed by a second wave, a much bigger wave of fatalities through hunger and disease. And so the first was largely over in a matter of 15 months, terrible though it was. The second wave rolled on for many years, killed many, many more people. And the point of that graph was exactly the point that you've been making. We know, and we have known for years, if not decades, what these conflicts entail. And the ratio of direct to indirect deaths is at a minimum 1 to 3 in a place like Bosnia, where in the 1990s it was 1 to 3. In many other conflicts, it's much higher. So we can sadly predict with grim certitude that what we are seeing today is going to be sadly surpassed by even greater figures. So today, the official death toll passed 40,000. We know, as you said, that there are many thousands more trapped under the rubble. But those deaths are likely to be only a fraction of the true number. In World War II, more people died from hunger alone than died from direct violence. In Bosnia, as I mentioned, the ratio was 1 to 3. In Iraq, it was higher. In places like Congo, it's many, many times higher. And they last longer. It's like the rumble of thunder that follows a flash of lightning. And we know that the effects are going to reverberate for decades, even for generations. We know, for example, from the studies of the long-term effects of malnutrition on the population of the Netherlands during the Dutch hunger winter of 1944-1945, that children who were in utero or who were infants at the time of the hunger, when they grew up, were not as tall as their elder or younger siblings. They didn't have the same levels of cognitive development. And little girls who were in that cohort, when they became mothers, their own children were not as healthy, did not grow as large, did not perform as well at school as their peers. So, we know, and we have known for decades what this kind of conflict means. There is no excuse for ignorance, for claiming ignorance. And this is a theme that I want to return to. And there's no room, I think, also for claiming that this is somehow normal. There is the aid security worker database, for example, is well worth consulting. And if you click on it, aidworkersecurity.org. When I last looked at it earlier today, 176 aid workers had been killed in the line of duty this year. 121 of those were in Gaza. The next worst place was Sudan with 12, South Sudan on 7. So, if Gaza has had 10 times as many fatalities amongst humanitarian workers doing their business as the next worst place in the world. The argument that, oh, these are just accidents, these happen in war, I think falls away. This is something, an order of magnitude, literally an order of magnitude more awful for aid workers. And we haven't mentioned health workers, or rather you have mentioned health workers, but with the same story holds for health workers. This is not something that can be explained away as the normal byproduct of conflict. And as you mentioned, food has long been an instrument of control. The quote that you gave from Dov Weissglass, the advisor to then Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, the idea is to put Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. That came from 2006. And then a year later, when Hamas took control of the authority in the Gaza Strip, Kogat developed a document, Food Consumption in the Gaza Strip, Red Lines, with a minimum diet of an average of 2,279 calories per day. Different amounts for men, for women, for children, taking into account farms, fisheries, etc. They allowed exactly that amount of food to enter. And they knew exactly. This is one of the remarkable differences between Gaza and other situations of food crisis that I've studied over the years, is that we know with astonishing precision the amount of food, the amount of water, the amount of shelter that is there. There's almost no room for error. In cases like rural Sudan, there are things like reservoirs of wild foods. Women can go out and gather wild grains and berries. In Gaza, those options are both very, very limited, and we know exactly what they are. There's no sort of unknown factor there. In Somalia, people may receive remittances. We know every single dollar or shekel that goes into Gaza. And as you mentioned, malnutrition and mortality rates were remarkably low, so that the daily mortality rate in Gaza prior to October the 7th was 0.08 per 10,000 per day. And this is highly relevant to an argument I'm just going to make about the thresholds for famine, because the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, which is the sort of the standard metric accredited by the UN for designating levels of food insecurity up to famine, was developed some 20 years ago for the Horn of Africa, places that I was working in, Somalia, Southeast Ethiopia, South Sudan, where the background mortality is about 5 or 6 times higher than that. And so it was relatively straightforward when the debates were had, what level of general mortality in a population should we declare famine? They determined, I was among them, determined a level of 2 per 10,000 per day, which was about 6 to 7 times the normal rate. In Gaza, that's about 50 times the normal rate. So things have to deteriorate that much more in Gaza to get to levels that are standard for the IPC declaring food emergency, IPC 4, or famine, IPC 5, than they are in comparable situations like Gaza, like Somalia, like South Sudan, like Northeast Nigeria. Same for malnutrition. But what we see, however, is something very interesting, very disturbing, but also very revealing over the last few months, which is the Weissglass doctrine of putting Palestinians on a diet, not letting them die of hunger, has been revised. They may now die of hunger, but just not to a level at which the IPC will say this is famine. And we've seen this very, very clearly over the last 4 months. So the IPC has a very complex and sophisticated set of criteria for saying this is famine. And they do it proactively. They don't want to say, let's wait until 100,000 people have died of hunger, because that's too late. They want to say, in this particular case, in this particular locality, 20% of the population is suffering from severe food insecurity, levels of malnutrition, levels of mortality, such that we consider this famine. And as I just mentioned, those thresholds were set with populations like Somalia, like South Sudan in mind. And so, things have to get that much worse in a population like Gaza to reach those thresholds. The Israeli authorities have begun to understand this. The first IPC report was in December. They were alarmed by this. The second IPC report was in March, and USAID's FuseNet came up with a very, very similar finding that famine was imminent in northern Gaza. And this actually really alarmed Israel and alarmed the United States. Whether they cared about the lives of the people or they cared about their reputation, I won't judge. But it certainly alarmed them enough to act, because famine declarations are extremely rare. We've had one just last week for Sudan. Prior to that, it was 2 in Somalia, 2017, 2020, sorry, South Sudan, 2020 and 2017, 1 in Somalia, 2011. So very, very rare. And to have a famine declaration or even a near famine declaration for Gaza would have been, I think, exceptionally politically embarrassing. It doesn't have legal force, but it is politically very, very embarrassing. And about 6 weeks ago, the IPC issued its third report, and its headline was "High Risk of Famine Persists," which was a step back from its previous finding. And it was referring specifically to northern Gaza, where the situation had not deteriorated according to its metrics between March and June. Rafah is a different story. The Rafah disaster, tragedy, starvation crime, war crime, in my view, was just beginning to unfold then. That has not been measured. That is not part of the story they were telling. But the story that the IPC told was that the numbers of people in what IPC 5, the worst category of catastrophe or famine, had fallen in northern Gaza. The numbers of people who were receiving food aid had risen in northern Gaza from about 7.4% in February to about 30% in March to about 80%. So larger numbers of people were getting rations, and the situation had not resolved itself by any means. If you read the report, you will see still how disastrous it was, how this multidimensional disaster of food crisis, of lack of water, lack of shelter, people being forced to move, was continuing to unfold. The details are absolutely horrific. But that headline of famine the situation was hovering just below that deadline. So as it were, the Kogat Israeli doctrine was they may die of starvation, but not at a level where the UN will declare famine. Now, when this report was made public, a number of Israeli sources, Kogat itself, and also a group of Israeli nutritionists headed by Dr. Naomi Flis-Okavov, published a non-peer-reviewed data saying to the effect that this whole famine warning was scaremongering, that enough food had been going in, that the calorie count was sufficient to feed Gaza, actually, the population of Gaza plentifully. Now, this account is actually deeply flawed on the story, deeply flawed on a number of accounts. The methodology was very poor and very opaque. The data were not made, the data basis on which the arguments were made were not made public. And it was looking essentially only at food availability. And there are many, many cases in which we've had plenty of food availability in a country or a territory, but people cannot access it. If it's aid, they cannot get, as it were, the last mile to the aid. Or if it's in the market, they simply don't have the money to buy it. And terrible famines have unfolded in history where one or other of these situations have prevailed. And we've known this. Well, and this is precisely why the IPC does not use a food availability metric, and it cannot be used for saying there is no famine. But the other thing that I think that is perhaps even more significant about this, I mean, I think we can dismiss those who say the IPC was scaremongering, it invented a famine, because clearly it did not, because what it did was it provoked Israel into responding. And perhaps it provoked also the United States into pushing Israel to respond. But what that shows is that Israel has the capacity to turn this tap on and off as it wishes on a daily basis. It is very rare in such a situation to see a population, the status of nutritional status of a population being so sensitive to changes in humanitarian access. So in the case of Sudan, for example, it will take many months before opening access routes actually has a real impact on the nutritional status of the population. In Gaza, because it is so small, access, if it is guaranteed by Israel, is so straightforward, it can happen in a matter of days. And the data and the graphs in that IPC report show exactly how Israel could, should it want to do so, prevent the situation from deteriorating, or indeed could ameliorate the situation very, very easily with action. And this, I think, is a very, very critical point in terms of culpability, because starvation crimes, the crime of inflicting humanitarian emergency that kills thousands or tens of thousands, whether or not it reaches the threshold of famine, is different to other atrocity crimes. An atrocity crime of a massacre, when the shooting stops, the dying stops, or almost stops. I mean, you are physicians, you know that some people will die of their wounds later, and particularly if they're not given good medical treatment immediately. But essentially, the tale of dying will be will fall away. In the case of the starvation as an atrocity crime, it unfolds over weeks and months. So if there is a warning that it is unfolding, it is surely legally incumbent upon those responsible to actually prevent it, whether under the Genocide Convention, under international criminal law, or under international humanitarian law. And the first warnings were given in the very earliest days. The first clear warning was given by the IPC at the beginning of December. The second, and nothing was done on the basis of that warning. The second major sort of IPC warning was in March, and enough was done not to prevent the humanitarian catastrophe, just to prevent it from going over that particular cliff that is famine. And I think that story of warning and the ability to act to prevent or to ameliorate tells us all we need to know about the culpability. The other thing that I just want to say in closing is I want to quote the Israeli judge Aharon Barak, who was nominated by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to sit on the International Court of Justice to hear the case brought by South Africa against Israel on the charge of genocide. Now, Barak strenuously opposes the case of genocide. He disputes, in fact, even the legitimacy of South Africa bringing the case. But in the second provisional order that was issued in April, he voted in favor of immediate, unconditional humanitarian relief throughout the Gaza Strip in coordination with the United Nations, on the grounds that Israel had humanitarian obligations that it was required to meet. And that made that ruling by the court unanimous, with Israel's own judge voting in favor. And he did it on the basis of humanitarian conscience and an acknowledgement that the facts of the case, the facts of the humanitarian case, put a non-negotiable obligation on Israel, which had the responsibility for stopping this. And how it is possible for anybody who has any acknowledgement of facts, of analysis, or of ethics in the United States government, or indeed in the Israeli government, to fail to recognize this defeats me. This is a kind of famine denialism that is redolent of the atrocity and genocide denialism that many scholars over the last 75 years have spent their entire careers trying to overcome and confound. So let me conclude with that point, and I'm sure there will be many questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duval. Thank you, Alex. Again, a very sobering and very professional presentation. I wish this was not true. I wish we did not live to see this happening in the 21st century. Unfortunately, there is an almost consensus now, international consensus, that what's happening is a genocide that has been committed by Israel as a government, as a nation, against the people of Gaza. Genocide scholar Omar Bartov came with an article yesterday or the day before, after his visit to Israel, that confirms that all our worries about the intent to commit genocide are actually factual. And it's not just from the Israeli leadership, it's from the Israeli people themselves, even his friends, even the leftists, the liberals, the ones who used to claim they want to have peace. But thank you for this presentation. We have a few questions for you all. But first of all, I want to ask my questions for both of you, if you don't mind. As a medical community, again, we all agree with what you said. Thank you for offering this detailed and scientific information about what's happening. But what do you recommend that us as a medical community should do? What is in our capacity as a medical community, as American citizens, international people? Since you are, professionals in your fields, what do you think? What do you recommend that we can do more to stop this? Because unfortunately, it's still going on 11 months on. If genocide is the crime of all crimes, I think the genocide of Gaza is the genocide of all genocides, because it's the first genocide in history that has been broadcasted live by the victims in front of the whole world for 11 months. And we're all witnesses and in various degrees maybe complicit in this crime. So go ahead, Alex. Either one of you can start to respond to my question, please.
I think that educating the general public is just enormously important. And I think that what we see is that public opinion is shifting, particularly among the young. And we hope and pray that this has an impact on policy. I think events like this are tremendously important, and I'm very impressed by the creativity, the steadfastness of many who've come out onto the streets and had protests or encampments. And I'm sure when colleges and universities resume, there will be more of them, and they're doing so under a barrage of hostile propaganda, but they are for the most part, not being deterred.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I live in the UK, where health workers are always a very large block at the protests, wearing their scrubs, and they tend to get a lot of attention, and they should rightly do so. So I would echo what Alex said and saying, and yes, please use your platform as health workers to get those messages out, and to talk about the fact that that bombing a school is going to kill 100 people, bombing a water facility is going to kill many more people. One is a more dramatic thing that will get on the news, and one will be ignored, certainly by U.S. spokespeople. So getting the word out that those should never be normalized. The displacing people also has health effects, also kills people. Israel has tried to defend a lot of its atrocities by saying, well, no, it's okay because we displaced all those people. That's also a war crime and also has health outcomes attached to it. So reminding, educating everyone of that. I think you're muted, Carmen.
Yeah, let me go ahead. I'll go over a few questions. Go ahead, Karama.
I just asked Karina to speak because she has her hand raised and she wants to speak live. Please unmute yourself, Karina, and ask your question. Maybe you can take some of the questions, Nidal, from the Q&A.
Yeah, I think for the people who are not in the panel, maybe you have to invite them to the panel to be able to ask questions. If Ribhi is here, he should help us with that. But we can go from the comments. We have a few questions here. Again, many people asked about the role of the International Criminal Court and the ICJ. What else can they do to help stop this active genocide? If either one of you want to respond to this question, please.
Let me have a first stab at it. I think the fact that the ICC prosecutor has issued the 2 arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant has shaken, if not those 2 men, it certainly has shaken European governments who. And it's very striking how one of the things that this conflict has really shown is that the US, which hasn't been part of the ICC, it's not a member state for the Rome Statute. They always worked under the assumption that these courts would be going after people whom they agreed were bad people, like Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, like the junta in Myanmar, like Vladimir Putin. And so they were very eager to empower these institutions. And when the same metrics, the same standards are applied to Israel, they become very, very nervous, and they are caught in what is very clearly a double standard. And I think that is having an impact. Same with the ICJ. The many Western governments were party to a case brought by Gambia against Myanmar. And then suddenly they realize that exactly those precedents, those arguments are being used by South Africa against Israel, and they worry. And it resonates with Many of the people actually in Britain's Labour government, I mean, they are legally competent and with the public. So I think it's unlikely that the law as such is going to stop Israel, but it has an important impact on public opinion.
Great. Just to add to that, what Alex said, but also, I think the ICJ decision recently that unrelated to the genocide, that Israel's settlements are illegal and must be removed, that Israel is an apartheid state, that reparations are due to the Palestinian people, that third-party countries should not be giving weapons to or supplying support to anything related to the occupation. It came out a few weeks ago. It was hardly in the news, I think, in the US. To lawyers, it's a huge deal because we're no longer making the argument that all these things are true, that the occupation is illegal. Now we can just say that is international law. And when protesters are harassing Kamala Harris at an event, they can legitimately say, we are asking you to comply with international law. The ICJ has also, in relation to the genocide, put out 3 orders and 1 decision, as Alex said, ordering that food be delivered unimpeded. The US will ignore these orders and Israel will ignore these orders, but the international community can, if they choose to, and they may increasingly do so, start complying with those orders, start complying with international law.
Thank you. I have another question here for Dr. Diwal. What's the situation now in Rafah, and how can people stay informed about the food security and the food situation and the aid situation throughout Gaza, whether south or north?
So I'm afraid I don't have up-to-date details about Rafah, but it is calamitous. I mean, this was the place. This was until the offensive that was mounted by the IDF. This was the one place where the humanitarian operation could be said to have been working, albeit at a minimum. And for that reason, the President Biden and others, implored Israel not to go and mount that offensive. It had no impact, as we know. They went ahead and did it. Getting accurate data out of these areas is becoming more and more difficult. So beyond saying that it is calamitous, and those who follow it professionally fear that famine conditions are well underway among the stricken populations. Beyond saying that, I can't add much. There is good, there is news coverage particularly on Al Jazeera. I'm sure many of us rely on it very, very heavily. And the many, not all, but many of the humanitarian organizations also do provide good information. But Alex, I'm sure you follow this more closely.
No, I also don't have very up-to-date information, only what I had prepared back in May, so it's probably changed quite a bit since then.
Karama, are there any other people who have questions or anyone raising their hand? If you don't mind, please.
Yes, there are some new questions. I mean, this is probably from Sarah Mushtaq. Can you comment on the impact of starvation on epigenetics?
Sure thing. Yeah, so Alex already talked about the Dutch study, a study of about 300,000 Dutch men who were in utero, who were in the first trimester during World War II. during the Dutch hunger, 44 to 45. And we know from that study that the people in utero had negative health outcomes, had shorter lifespans, were more susceptible to cardiovascular disease. We know from other intentional starvations in Bangladesh during the British Raj and in China in the 50s that starvation can be linked to obesity even 1 or 2 generations later, as Dr. DeVos said. So yeah, that's something that is probably going to be studied in Gaza over the next few years, morbidly.
Yeah, so it's basically it's a multi-generational effect that is transmitted by the DNA from one generation to another that will affect not just this generation, but the coming ones, which makes this even more urgent. From Sulaiman Hussein, in your presentation, you made mention of how activists were able to tackle similar instances of genocide in the last few decades. What can Palestine solidarity activists learn from Uyghur, Rohingya, or Kashmiri activists who have faced somewhat similar precedents in Gaza? Was it Alex Smith who mentioned that? Alex?
I think we can, regardless of where this came from, I think I mean, sadly, those cases cited are not cases which where there has been great success in actually preventing the crime from being perpetrated, and the perpetrators from getting away with it. And I think one of the errors that was made among many earlier activists around this issue was the assumption that somehow the United States had the capacity and will and the unique sort of role of being the world's policeman for stopping genocide. And the director of USAID, Samantha Power, wrote a famous book, The Problem from Hell, which essentially made the argument that the United States could, whenever it and wherever it wanted, intervene to stop genocide. And actually, this was the way for genocides to be ended. Now, I think she now finds herself in the awkward position that the hypothesis on which she built her academic career and her public profile has run into the fact that she is serving as a senior member of a government that is doing exactly the opposite, and maybe Alex Smith would like to comment on that in a moment. But I think what this points to is the fact that anti-genocide activists need to make a broader appeal, need to make an appeal beyond the United States to the rest of the world. And this is why I think the South African case is perhaps so important, because here you have a case brought by a government with massive popular support among the South African people, which has actually resonated across much of the world on this case, and this this points to a broader constituency that has not been mobilized, not been called upon by many of the anti-genocide movements.
Mr. Smith, do you want to answer that question too? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I was going to kind of turn the question around, much like Alex did, and say that, when the United States, which was sort of the inventor of international law back post-World War II, turns its back on the whole framework and says it's meaningless, and, these decisions have no weight, that the ICJ opinions are advisory only, that they have no enforcement. What's to stop Myanmar China, India from deciding, we have a couple of tens of thousands of Muslims we'd like to exterminate, and who's to say that that's wrong? Certainly not the United States at this point. So what really troubles me is that I, have spent my whole life believing that there is an international framework that's never really bound the United States from doing some horrible things, but which had some meaning in the world, and now that seems to be going by the wayside. Hopefully not globally. Hopefully the U.S. and Israel remain, the only parties that just simply ignore international law.
Yeah, thank you. Again, the problem is in this situation, it's even worse than Rohingya or Myanmar, because in that case, the U.S. is not actually funding and supporting and sending the weapons and the money and providing the political and diplomatic coverage for a genocide. So in this situation, the United States is actually a perpetrator of the genocide, which makes it much harder. And I know we keep going back to Mr. Smith, but since you were close in the administration, we still need more guidance from you. What can we do to pressure the administration, the politicians? What leverages? We try to talk to them, we try to raise awareness, we try to have advocacy, and there has been some change in rhetoric. There has been maybe some more support from the people. We're not against the people. The people actually, 80% of the Americans are, for ceasefire to stop this genocide. More than half of them agree that this is a genocide. It's just, since you've been there in those corridors, I know maybe you're not close enough, but what other ideas, what other suggestions that you have for us as a community, as a healthcare community, that we can have more influence? Thank you.
Yeah, so I certainly wasn't rubbing shoulders with Blinken every day. That wasn't my level at stage with USAID. I think, just repeating, there's that old saying that by the time you're sick of saying something, people are hearing it for the first time. As you said, more than half of Americans, a big majority of Democrats, believe that Israel is committing genocide, and that's encouraging that people will hopefully pressure politicians at every level to change course. At the same time, it's very sad to know that the majority of Americans don't know who's killed more people on which side, Israelis or Palestinians. Americans are woefully uneducated about the issue. A lot of that is not their fault. It's due to our media coverage of the region. So I think, part of the way to make change is to educate, to let people know that this is a huge catastrophe, that it's intentional, that the famine is man-made, and that it can be stopped with a phone call, as it was back in '82 when Reagan decided to end the war in Lebanon by calling Israel and telling them to stop. And again, just saying, these are illegal actions under both international law and also our domestic laws, the Leahy laws, which prevent us from giving weapons to a state that's engaged in human rights abuses, possibly. So yeah, just repeating those simple messages.
I'm just going to say something. I mean, it's very clear that what we are seeing is that genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity are major health crises, and they affect the population in a way that should make every single medical professional speak up and scream. And what we are seeing is that many doctors, nurses, they choose not to engage, they choose not to educate themselves, and we feel that there is a lot of work to be done in those areas where everybody should be able to identify a genocide as a medical emergency and speak up against it. And this is the premise of Doctors Against Genocide, and this is why we, Dr. Jabbour and myself, we co-founded this organization with this mission to allow the medical community to give the tool to the medical community to be able to identify the warning signs of a genocide, warning signs of war crimes, and assert that this is a medical emergency. And this is something that every medical professional should be able to speak up against, regardless of their religion, their political affiliation. There should not be politics in this. This is a public health crisis and a medical crisis. And this is our really life mission, to keep working in these spaces and make our colleagues be obligated morally to speak up every time. We have seen how a lot of us in the medical community have been silenced. Dr. Waal and myself experienced something where, you know, a lot of pushback against us speaking up about Gaza. And just the fact that this even happened is a disgrace, especially when we are seeing how this is an urgent medical crisis. It is not politics, it is medical, and it's a health crisis. And I cannot emphasize this enough and keep saying it enough to my colleagues and to everybody who listens.
Karina is with us. Do you have a question, Karina?
I don't know if she can hear us. She's been with us for a while.
Oh, okay. So yeah, as Karama mentioned, the role of the medical community to intervene and try to raise awareness and try to do all what they can to stop these crimes is actually a medical intervention. It is not playing politics. It's not stepping on somebody else's feet or roles. This is actually part of the oath of medicine. Going to school, when you swear an oath to protect life, to preserve the sanctity of life, every life, whether they are here in the States or overseas, whether they're Jews, Muslims, Christians, Palestinians, Chinese. Preserving life means we have to stop these crimes when they happen, and we need to educate ourselves and our community to be more aware, to check for the warning signs of these crimes, try to stop them as early as possible if we can. But in this situation, the genocide is active and it's happening. And I think having a ceasefire, mobilizing our communities, the healthcare worker, our hospitals, our institutions who have been unfortunately complicit and silent so far. Beyond that, they are even silencing those who try to speak up. So if they all join in this call, they can add more to medicine and to humanity and to the medical profession than all the procedures, all the medical aid that we can send to Gaza or any other, areas that is, suffering these atrocities, because we just simply can save more lives doing this action. So Doctors Against Genocide is about that. It's about saving more lives by preventing crimes, by stopping crimes. Thank you, Dr. Diwal and Mr. Smith, for being with us. It has been, again, sobering presentation. Thank you for all the evidence-based data, the information that you shared. Thank you everyone who joined this webinar with us. It has been very educational, and I hopefully every and each one of us can go home and thinking what else can they do in their institution with their colleagues to raise more awareness about this, to push more to stop this genocide. And I hope a term called genocide fatigue never comes to life. There is nothing called genocide fatigue. It should never be entertained by anyone. And whenever we feel a little bit depressed or hopeless that we cannot do more, just remember the children, the women, the pregnant women, the elderly people who are going through this for the last 11 months. So with all the trouble, all the heartache that every one of us who are witnesses to this are going through, it's thousands of times worse to the people who are on the receiving end of this genocide. So thank you for your advocacy. Dr. Diwal and Mr. Smith. Thank you for your strong voice. Thank you everyone who's been with us, and hopefully we can all make a difference. We just need to do more, because with all what we did, the genocide is still ongoing. This means we need to double up our efforts. We need to speak louder. We need to keep thinking of other ways that we can make a difference and an influence and stop this atrocity. Thank you. Any closing remarks from Dr. Diwal and Dr. Smith, please?
Let me make one closing remark, which is that while all of you who have family, relatives, colleagues, friends in Gaza who are suffering, you are always considering yourself extraordinarily lucky not to be there personally. Don't forget, don't fail to take care of yourself, because actually the trauma, the second-hand trauma, as it were, of all those who are outside but have loved ones inside, that is not to be underestimated. And if you don't care for yourselves, if you don't seek to put together networks for professional counseling and support, not only will you suffer, but you will not be able to perform what you so want to do, these acts of solidarity. So please do care for yourselves.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diwal. I think just, having the space to be advocates is therapeutic for many of us. Without that, it would be much more frustrating.
Mr. Smith, any closing remarks?
No, I just want to thank all of you for hosting this, and also for, as you pointed out at the end, putting things in perspective. The work that we're doing pales in comparison to people who are on the ground. I think we should all be looking for ways that we can help now and in the near future. I do want to believe that eventually there will be a ceasefire, there will be a surging in of aid, and that all of us will have opportunities to volunteer in any way we can. USAID's not going to do it, but we can all plan for the day after, because that planning needs to happen.
Inshallah. And for anyone who's interested in our work in Doctors Against Genocide, please reach out, follow us, sign up, join our coalition and our partners, Healthcare Workers for Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace, Health Advisory have been amazing partners. We're grateful to all of the people who share us in this fight, and thank you so much, and good night, and see you all soon.
Can I add one more thing, please? Grama?
Yes,
Yeah. So me and Dr. Hawash just came back from a visit to Palestine, to the West Bank, and to Jordan. It was kind of an assessment of needs. We already know the huge amount of need. We're also in touch with Al Auda Hospital in Gaza that has multiple locations throughout the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, most of their hospitals and clinics have been bombed and destroyed. Only few of them are partially functional. They managed to open some temporary few locations here and there, some mobile clinics, but they are still in need of a lot of help. We tried or managed to get some connections through Jordan, through the Hashemite committee there, to try to send them some aid. So those on the call, if they can help and donate, please. This will help us help more the people in Gaza. The need in the West Bank is also very dire. The refugee camps, a lot of people are suffering. No one has been working the last 11 months. So with your help and your support, we can help more people there. We are going to be having another webinar with more detailed information about the projects that we are planning to have both in Gaza and the West Bank. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you everyone for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Waal and Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night. Yes. Bye-bye.